Welcome to Fast Politics, Michael Waldman.
It's great to be with you again, Molly.
So you head the Brennan Center for Justice, which is extremely important legal resource. You provide torts, you provide all of the work, the meat for many of the nonprofits that protect our democracy. You guys have a truly harrowing report about the midterms and the Trump administration's plan for them. Can you talk us through it? And first, I would love you to talk just like before you even start talking us through it, just explain to us a little bit, just like a quick refresher on what Brennan does and where you are in this process.
Sure. So we are a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen, to reform, and when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in this country so they work for everybody. And so, as you can imagine, this is an intense time given how much assault there is on our democracy. And a lot of the details, a lot of the arcane stuff turns out to matter a lot. And so we're mostly a think tank, also an advocacy group and a communications hub. Um, and we're busy. Uh, the it really feels in a lot of ways like in the last week or two that the 2026 midterms have kind of swung into view as the looming next year of political activity in this country. And the key thing is voters in our democracy have to have the final say, and they have to have the final say in 2026. And in the last several elections, there were a lot of pressures on the election system from COVID to violence, but the system held. Election
Right.
officials from both parties worked well together, and the elections were accurate and safe and secure. But now, as our new analysis shows, there's a new factor that we've not had before, which is the federal government itself as a
Right.
threat to the elections. A concerted campaign by the Trump administration to undermine the 2026 elections. And some of this stuff is, well known, more or less. Some of it is kind of under the radar, but it clearly is adding up to a concerted campaign. And in this new analysis that we published this week, we connect the dots.
So the first thing is very well known, which is that Trump is trying to re-gerrymander states in time for the midterms. And that he's even said, for example, he said in Texas that he was entitled to 5 more seats. So talk us through that, because I feel like that's the first part of the story.
Yeah, it is. And interestingly, that came up so recently, so abruptly. It's not in this report, but there's no question that this there's a lot going on. And that's the
Right.
most visible.
Right.
Now, our report, as great as it is, doesn't have people, hiding in motels in the by the interstate. That thing of leaving Austin to avoid a quorum on gerrymandering this is not actually the first time that's happened in Texas. This is kind of a bit of a tradition. We want Congress to be representative. Gerrymandering has been bad throughout American history. It's a bad thing for politicians to choose the voters rather than the other way around. What is happening in Texas is particularly egregious. It is just being explicitly done to squeeze 5 seats out for the Republicans. It's at the expense of very often of voters of color. It's being done under the orders of someone who doesn't live in Texas, Donald Trump. And it's in the middle of the decade. Remember, the census happens every 10 years, and that's when you're supposed to draw the district lines. So it's a big fight. The Democrats have left the state to avoid a quorum. The Republican leadership of the state is trying to have them arrested. I don't think that's going to work. It's not a surprise that the Democrats in blue states are readying a response, are responding accordingly.
Right.
And I don't think we should be surprised by that. I don't think it's a good thing ultimately for the country to have this kind of
Certainly
partisan
not.
arms race. So the
Yeah.
final answer, I think it's really important that we never lose sight of the following. The answer has to be ultimately national standards that apply to red states and blue states alike. And, the Supreme Court was going to do this and then backed out and said that federal courts cannot police partisan gerrymandering, but Congress could do it. The Freedom to Vote Act, which you've heard me
Yeah.
rant about, came really close to passage 2 years ago. It would ban gerrymandering nationwide in red states
Yeah.
and in blue states and bar mid-decade redistricting. In other words, if
Right.
it had become law, this would not be
Not
happening.
be
And
legal.
it's really
Yeah.
critical that politicians who talk about democracy, who like to give speeches about democracy being under threat, that when they get their hands on the levers of power, do something about protecting democracy, unrig the system just as enthusiastically and energetically as some other politicians are rigging the system.
Being a system.
So
Yeah.
that's that piece of it. And you're going to see this play out in a bunch of states. California is considering putting a new map on the ballot
In
in November
November.
because the redistricting commission was created not by Democrats, but actually by voters and by
Yeah.
Governor Schwarzenegger backing it. He's a Republican. And in other states like Illinois and New York and Maryland, again, the Democrats are looking to in effect, fight fire with fire. But ultimately, the answer is national standards, I think. But that's only part of the story. The
Right. And
rules about voting and the threats to the voting system, with a little less drama, are really important and unnerving.
so that is what I wanted to talk about next. So in this report, you have a bunch of different issues that the federal government is trying to mess with elections with. And I would love you to talk about this attempting to rewrite election rules and interfere with election administration via executive order, because executive orders, they don't have a ton of legal weight. It's more like just, they're not, it's not real, but it's real if the Supreme Court will allow it to stand. So
Very
talk us
often,
through
they're
what it
like a
is.
malevolent press release. But
Exactly. A
and
malevolent press release. I'm writing that down. That's very smart.
so the key thing to start is to remember that under the law and under the Constitution, states run elections, and the Congress can pass laws setting national standards, but the executive branch, and especially the president, has almost no role in these elections under normal circumstances. So it's just Trump's impersonal attempts to seize control over the election
Right.
system at all is its own form of an egregious breach.
Mhm.
Um, Among the things that are part of this kind of concerted strategy is an executive order, as you said, that was one of gazillions, and so it was easy to lose sight of, that would require, if it were to go into effect, you to show a passport to register to vote in the
Right.
United States under the federal form. Which, half of all Americans don't have a passport. It wouldn't even allow a birth certificate, as problematic as that is. Need to have a passport or
Right.
something like that. What the Trump White House has done as well is purge the election security officials and agencies that have been doing a good job of helping states protect their elections. It is trying to require states to turn over voter data to Doge, because
Right.
what could go
'Cause
wrong
why
with
not?
that,
Yeah,
right? Or find
exactly.
the fraud, just like they found all those non-existent frauds in
Whatever.
Social
Yeah.
Security. And according to the Associated Press, in the last few days, 19 states already have gotten demands or requests from the Justice Department for their voter records. So this is
Yeah.
happening. The whole of the federal government is being sort of weaponized in this way. And of course, as you know, Trump himself went to the Justice Department, spoke to the cheering attorneys who he had appointed there, and said, "I want you to prosecute election officials."
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
a whole gearing up of the prosecution mechanisms to threaten these election officials. And when you think about what happened in 2020, it was a handful of Republican, very often, officials at different levels of government who, whatever they might have done wrong or right, other realms of their work, stood up. Whether it was Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, who, wouldn't, quote, find 11,000 votes, or Attorney General Barr, who told Trump that that it was a Barr nerd epithet, that his claims of fraud
Right.
were BS. So, now the administration is stocked with election deniers. So all of this adds up to something new. We haven't had this before in this country, to have the federal government weigh in, put its thumb on the scale in this way.
So you have the executive orders, and then you have what's happened I think it's already happened in Wyoming, right? Where some red states are mandating proof of whatever.
Well, some states are trying to have done it and actually backed off doing it because it turned out it disenfranchised so many eligible voters, including,
Yeah.
y
Trump
you know
voters too, because Trump
yeah,
has those low
it
frequency
there's a reason
voters
why
too.
states don't do this, and
Yeah.
now, this a lot of this goes back to this conspiracy theory that there's lots of non-citizens who are voting, and it's not true. And states have very robust systems in place to make sure that only citizens are voting. Only citizens should vote, but the good news is only citizens basically do
Do
vote.
vote. And there's
Um,
very little evidence of non-citizens voting.
yeah, and people, as you can, we have found when we make these arguments to people publicly that it's less effective to point out that it doesn't happen or that it's illegal already many times over. But more that the states take this really seriously and have a lot of safeguards in place, um, to prevent cheating of that kind.
So executive orders, and then one of the scarier ones is it's messing with the machines, the election equipment.
Yes.
So talk us through that.
So if you remember, one of the kooky things Trump tried to do in 2020 was to seize the voting machines. I don't know what that would have told him, but the executive order that they did earlier in the year would basically decertify, take away the approval for the use of the voting machines that are used all over the country. One of the notions that sometimes Trump and his people have is that all ballots should be counted by hand.
Right.
Um, And that's a really bad idea because you actually get more errors that way, and it also would delay the counting, and, there's a reason we as a society have moved past counting things on our fingers. Um, but but, a lot of these things, as you say, are in this executive order. One of the things that's happened, broadly speaking, is the courts have stepped up on a lot of these things. In particular, this is something the Brennan Center did. We represented the League of Women Voters in a lawsuit on this executive order, and a federal court actually blocked some of the worst parts of it. The parts
Right.
that where Trump is pretending to order an independent agency that he has no authority over to do these things. But it's still playing out in the courts, and the story isn't finished yet.
So you have the seizing machines, which is really scary. And then you have another thing, which I also thought was horrifying, accessing sensitive voter file data. Explain to us what the story there is.
Well, the states keep these voter records. There's lots of sensitive stuff in it, often social security numbers, other things like that. The federal government has no place demanding that data just to look at it. What it seems to be the case is that this will be used to say, aha, look at all the fraud, and to try to undermine the elections in advance. A lot of this violates privacy rules. A lot of it is illegal. Some of it, as I said, came in this demand that the states turn over these records to Doge, or they will lose federal money. Now you're starting to see the Justice Department make these demands, and there are now task forces set up in the Justice Department, in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., and other places that are very explicitly rattling the cage to threaten election officials, to threaten prosecutions of election officials who do their job. And there's a guy named Chris Krebs. I don't know if you have
Mhm.
heard of it, but he was just the head of cybersecurity in the Trump Department of Homeland Security in 2020, and he said accurately that the 2020 election was secure and the most secure in history. And Trump fired him at the time, and now he's having him investigated. And the goal here is to rattle and shake the confidence and shake the courage of state and local officials so that when it should be necessary, when the moment comes and they need to show their backbone, they'll be afraid to do it. So far, the state and local officials have been great. They know their job. None of them signed up for being high stakes combatants in politics. They're not the big glamour jobs. A lot of the stuff that they're being asked to do is illegal. We and others are talking to lots of lawyers to make sure people know what their legal remedies are
Right.
and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's really scary to me. It's largely an intimidation campaign, right?
Yes, I think it's an intimidation campaign that will grow in intensity over the months. And the question again is, well, why? What's the end game? Why do this? And I do think that undermining public confidence in the results, making people think wrongly that there's lots of fraud, endlessly discovering, aha, now we found the smoking gun of the phantom voters and this and that kind of stuff to create a fog of misinformation about the elections in advance seems to be one of the goals.
So, what can people do if you're listening to this and you're freaking out, or you read it last weekend and with your husband and both freaked out about it? What can people do?
So, first of all, back up those state and local officials. Let them know that you understand what they're going through. They need to stand strong. They need to do their part. They need support from all across the political spectrum. As the elections draw closer, there are all kinds of things people can do, working with law enforcement and others, poll watching and those things, though it's a little early for that. It's really important that courts do their part as well. And like I said, a lot of them have. But we haven't heard from the Supreme Court on a lot of this stuff. So much of this effort is illegal, and courts need to continue to rule when that comes before them on that. And ultimately, I think that it is a lot harder to rig an election. There's a lot harder to steal an election when lots of people are voting and lots of people are yelling and lots of people are watching. And the more focus on this there is, the better it is, because I think one of the things that I hope comes out of this period of democratic destruction is a renewed commitment to fixing our democracy and making sure that this kind of thing can't happen again. I worry that, like, as you may have followed, there's a lot of chatter. Oh, what issues are there? Gee, Biden talked about democracy. That means it's a dud.
Right, right,
Uh,
right.
and I think that what we're seeing with the Texas gerrymander shows that no, these issues are really vital, and that we need some courage from some politicians to actually take action when they have the chance to strengthen democracy and not just issue press releases.
Right. And I mean, that is likely going to come later. Right now, probably the only thing anyone can do is try to protect our midterms so that people have the freedom to go and vote and so that the votes are, that no one messes with anything. One of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about is if there are free and fair elections and Democrats are able to regain the levers of power, there has to be an anti corruption legislation. Like, Democrats have spent a lot of time not legislating for any number of reasons. Sometimes it's a Kirsten Sinema that derails them. Sometimes it's their own anxiety about seeming overly partisan or whatever.
Yeah, so to give credit to Nancy Pelosi and people like that, they really push the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which were really important bills that would have addressed dark money in politics, that would have addressed gerrymandering, that would have strengthened early voting and automatic voter registration, a lot of the other things, restored the Voting Rights Act. Those bills had passed the House. They had a majority in the Senate. And the problem then was that two senators, Manchin and Sinema, who supported supposedly the bills, wouldn't change the filibuster rules to enable them to overcome the Republican blockade. I think it's the case now that Democrats, part of the lesson they drew from that whole period was they were going to change the filibuster rules to enable it to pass. Last year when visions danced in some of their heads about a trifecta, they made clear they were going to pass those bills with a majority vote. I think that right now there's a lot of looking at what the most important reforms are today because of the extraordinary corruption and the breaches of law and norms that we see from this administration. And so what are the corruption measures to deal with an era of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and the monetization of government? How can we address the Supreme Court and the role it
Yeah.
plays? I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for something like term limits as part of
Yeah.
any reform package. I think that it makes partisans of all parties uncomfortable, but I think there ultimately needs to be something on redistricting, as there was, and voting, of course, as well. So there's a lot of issues in play, and formulating what that package looks like. What counts is not just what one is against, but what one is for. And if you don't have a really robust vision for how to strengthen democracy, people are going to think it's just partisan wind. The main problem, honestly, in 2021 and 2022 was they waited, the White House under President Biden waited a long time to try to move that bill. And that's the kind of thing one needs to do right at the start and not worry about 12 editorial boards, if those exist anymore, saying, oh, woo, this is partisan.
Michael Waldman, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you
Thank you.
for keeping us sane and educated.